If you're a millennial or older, you likely remember that 20 to 30 years ago, people talked about going postal as a reference to mass shootings because the public imaginary had connected the events with post offices, because sadly, there had been a lot of postal employees who committed one of these atrocities at their job. But over the course of the last 30 years, the amount of these incidents has increased, and so has the press coverage. So our terminology and imaginary has evolved several times as well, to the point where people wouldn't really get the going postal reference anymore. But going back to the postal events, there are some theories about the working conditions at the time being very deplorable and management being ruthlessly tyrannical. But could this really drive someone to kill? And can stress or personal pain push someone over the limit? Or does it just show deep down who someone actually is? In this video, we're going to talk about a postal worker who snapped. While not the first postal shooter, I believe James Hanavan in Adelaide, Australia is, or even the first US postal shooter, I believe him to be the fourth or fifth. His case has 6 intriguing elements, making it arguably the first modern postal shooting. 1, this is the first US postal shooting that includes victims that are not just people in direct supervision roles or security guards who tried to stop the event. 2, this is the first US postal suspect to go after their coworkers. 3, this is the first postal event with 4 or more victims, meaning it falls into the Gun Violence Archive's definition of a mass shooting, which is 4 or more shot, which is to say injured or killed in a single event at the same general time and location, not including the shooter. If you're interested in more about this and how the FBI thinks about it, watch my previous video from last week. Number 4, this is the first postal shooting where the perpetrator resigned before committing the event. 5, the perpetrator was under a lot of emotional stress outside of work, and for the most part was well regarded by other people as a nice person, but there were some people who saw him differently than that. And number 6, the defense attempts a guilty by insanity plea with lots of really interesting consequences. Oh, and of course, my manager wants me to remind you to like and subscribe and comment and share with your friends and all that. And something about a bell, I don't really remember. Anyway, in 1983, Johnston, South Carolina in the United States was a one-stoplight town with a population of about 2,600 people. And all the idyllic charm and traditional mores you'd expect from a city that size in the South in the 80s. But in the early 80s, it was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. Perry Bush Smith, or PB as he was known, was 55 years old and had been working for the post office in Johnston, South Carolina for over 20 years in 1983. He was a thin man of average height with salt and pepper hair and a short beard. He was still energetic despite his age. And he seems like the kind of guy that most people would just label nice. PB was still married, and he had an adult son, Jimmy, and a daughter, I believe, named Dana. His son, Jimmy, 35, was a Vietnam vet who did 3 tours and then followed in his dad's footsteps, becoming a part-time postal worker after leaving the military. PB was well known in the community. A barista even commented this about PB frequenting their shop. He sat on that stool every morning and every afternoon and drank coffee. He was in here every day. Sadly for PB, some recent tragedies had befallen him, including his son Jimmy's suicide in December 1982. Jimmy believed that he was suffering the effects of Agent Orange, and this may have contributed to his suicide. Add to this the deteriorating health of his wife Frances, who recently had heart surgery, which is quite a lot of stress for someone to deal with, even a strong person. As it would for most people, all of this weighed heavily on him. His wife Frances says that PB became irritable and would not shave and would not keep himself well. She added that he wouldn't go out even to church after his son's suicide. And when you add working a demanding, stressful job like the post office, it gets much harder to deal with. So of course, this affected the quality of his work, and it wasn't long before his bosses became aware and reprimanded him for it. Despite being seen as overtly nice, PB was also very independent and proud. So this, plus the recent tragedies in his life, meant he was unable to really find the criticism constructive and took it as a very personal affront. Couldn't they see his pain? And things only got worse when he was caught leaving his letter satchel unattended for a few minutes on his route. His supervisor cut him a break, but after catching him leaving his satchel alone a few more times, PB was suspended. PB had developed this idea that the postmaster in Johnston, Charles McGee, was running his life. A supervisor began to notice his insubordination, noting that they had seen PB cursing Postmaster McGee and taking longer breaks than he was supposed to take. Minor things, it's true, but for a man in their 50s, clearly the hallmark of someone who's frustrated, hates their job, and just doesn't really care anymore. So the next time he makes an arguably minor mistake, delivering mail to the wrong address, they suspend him again. This only further embroiled PB, who thought McGee was out to get him. One of his coworkers also mentions that he became highly critical and aggressive enough to fight over the smallest of things. So of course, he didn't respond diplomatically to criticism. All of this boiled over in PB's mind, and by spring, his coworkers were split. Some believed he just needs to be given a break and cut some slack because of his grief and personal issues, and some just thought that he was rude. These coworkers believed that he was resistant to supervision and coaching and was resentful of anyone who tried to tell him what to do. But PB's claims of unfair treatment and anger towards Charles McGee only escalated as the days went by, until PB actually threatens to kill McGee and some others before rushing out of the post office. Postmaster McGee discusses this with the police chief, Robert Waldrop, who encourages McGee to swear out a peace warrant to have PB arrested as a precaution because he could pose a serious risk to McGee and others. McGee contemplates this for a while, but kindly decides not to have PB arrested. Not knowing the postmaster had actually cut him a huge break, PB continues this campaign of hatred towards McGee. PB stays on at the post office through the spring, but mutters to his daughter, "They're killing me." And on May 27th, he had had enough and put in his resignation. Albert Turner, a fellow postal employee, said he got mad one day when they wouldn't give him any help on his route and quit. Unfortunately, this time to stew in his thoughts only propelled his downfall and hatred of Postmaster Charles McGee. McGee had been postmaster for the last 4 years and had few problems other than these with PB. In fact, he was close with many of the townspeople and had become a staple. So when he announced that he was transferring to a post office in Hartsfield, Georgia, and his last day at the post office in Johnston would be August 19th, 1983, many of the people in town were sad to hear the news, but not PB. So either August 17th or 18th, PB does 3 things. He talks with a mail carrier who delivers him his mail. They discuss that Postmaster McGee is being transferred to another post office and have a polite, pleasant conversation. He visits the post office and asks if it's true that McGee's last day was August 19th, and if McGee would be in that day. He's told yes to both questions. McGee was very dedicated to his role, and even offered to stay an additional 2 weeks if his replacement needed any training. So in many ways, his last day was just another day at the office for McGee. And lastly, PB runs into insurance agent Michael Carpenter, who recalls, "I talked with him in the drugstore. He was always friendly." The drugstore is across the street from the post office, so it's entirely possible that PB spoke with Michael Carpenter immediately before or after he visited the post office. It's also unclear when specifically he came up with the plan to murder his colleagues, but likely it had been festering for some time. On August 19th, 1983, PB wakes up ready to execute his heinous plan. Right about 8 a.m., PB leaves his home and drives to the post office with the 12-gauge shotgun in his sedan. He walks through the employee entrance and back and locks it. He runs into Josephine Gibson. PB glares at her and says, "Joe, don't move." This causes the other employees to look up. PB yells, "Don't move or I'll kill all of you." Most comply, but Joe runs off. A little deeper into the post office, Postmaster McGee sees PB and yells, "He's got a gun! Everybody get out and run for your lives!" Then the postmaster opens a side exit for people to flee. McGee chases after his former employee, yelling, "PB, don't do it!" But as PB heads out the front door after Joe, McGee eventually just runs out the side door towards the pantry, a convenience store next door. Inside the pantry, McGee tells the 2 clerks, Sandra Burkett and Ida Mae Heath, to hide in the women's restroom. McGee hides in the storage closet and locks it. About a block away, Joe runs into Officer Robert Carroll, who was off duty at the time. After she tells Officer Carroll what's happening, he told her to go to the police station for help before rushing towards the post office himself. A few moments after PB had chased Joe out of the front door of the post office, Monroe Neese, 54, goes to check the door PB had exited through. PB must have seen him because he turns around and fires at the door twice. Pellets and part of the door hit Neese in the head and the right eye, knocking him to the floor. It's at this point that 35-year-old Alan Thomas dashes out of the post office, following the postmaster to the pantry, the convenience store next door. Because he's out front, PB sees Alan running and takes off after him. Both men running as fast as they can. PB catches up and fires, knocking Alan to the ground. In hot pursuit, the 6'5" tall officer Carroll sees PB shoot Alan and attempts to fire at him, but his gun misfires. Carroll then hides behind an air conditioner sticking out of the wall of a building. PB shoots Carroll. The air conditioner takes most of the shot, but the officer is hit in his left arm. PB rushes into the pantry. After reloading and thinking a moment, he rushes to the storeroom, breaks down the door, and shouts, "I told you I'd get you," before shooting McGee in the stomach and again in the chest. PB then yells, "I told you I'd get even with you, you son of a bitch," as he fires the second shot. PB walks out of the pantry towards the parking lot in the back of the post office, presumably in search of others or to flee, but it's unclear. At this point, a wounded officer Carroll points his weapon at PB and yells for the man to drop his gun. Carroll fires at him 3 times, missing PB. So PB drops his gun, puts his hands up, and slowly walks towards Officer Carroll in a resigned manner, saying that he wants to surrender. PB looks at Carroll and says, "Oh, I didn't know it was you. I didn't mean to shoot you." Officer Carroll handcuffs PB. And as he sits on the sidewalk, another postal employee, Albert Turner, walks by. PB looks at him and says, "You better be glad Joe ran, because you were next." Cops took PB Smith into custody, and the paramedics took the 3 surviving victims to the hospital. Carroll and Neese were kept overnight in the hospital, but released the next day. Alan Thomas needed intensive care, spinal fusions, and a variety of plastic surgeries, including reconnecting his ear, over the next several years. He suffers from permanent hearing damage and cannot fully use his right shoulder, but all 3 of them survived. Unfortunately, Postmaster McGee was pronounced dead at the scene. A postal spokesperson who was unnamed puts out an oddly cold statement that says, "This has put a damper on our day. Mr. McGee was well liked by all of us. He was an easygoing, likable person. We feel terribly bad about this." But despite the fact that a terrible tragedy had just befallen their community, the townspeople rallied together and supported each other like they had always done. For instance, police supervisor Henry Mosley said that, "We get calls all day from people wanting to know how the guy in the Augusta hospital is doing." Nobody expected nothing like that. You read about it in the newspapers or see it on television, but it just doesn't happen in your town. And about Officer Carroll, Mosley said, "He's a pretty good officer," and that was a courageous thing to do. Forrest Edwards, the mayor of Johnston, knew everyone involved and said, "Everybody's still in a state of shock. It's very difficult." They were both very fine men. Officer Carroll says about the event, "You always hear about it way off, and you never figure it's going to come in your backyard in a small community. I didn't think PB was capable of doing that." PB is charged with 1 murder and 3 counts of assault and battery with intent to kill. Judge Alan Dunn from Edgefield County orders PB held without bond on the murder trial and a $50,000 bond on each of the assault charges. PB was a past next-door neighbor of Judge Dunn's. He says about him, "This is really shocking to me. PB's one of the nicest fellows you'd ever want to meet. He's never had any kind of problems like this before, but his family has gone through a lot of tragedy lately." You read about things like this happening in a big city somewhere, but you just don't expect it to happen in a small town. Circuit Judge George Bell Timmerman Jr. denies PB bail and orders a 15-day mental evaluation to determine fitness to stand trial. Solicitor Donald Myers asks for all of the bond to be revoked, but the judge wants to determine if PB understood his actions and was fit to stand trial. So by mid-October, he is deemed mentally fit to stand trial. Then the question is overturned to a grand jury that orders PB to stand trial. At the beginning of this trial, the judge holds a hearing requested by the defense to argue for a plea of not guilty by way of insanity. With this as a background, defense attorney Gaston Ferry argues that PB's mental state is deteriorating. He cites as evidence that the doctors had just said that PB somehow believes that he was acting in self-defense, which of course is delusional. Because of this, PB was declared incapable of defense. However, Judge Timmerman takes the advice of the prosecution and orders him to be returned to the state mental hospital, but this time for a 60-day evaluation under a brand new medical staff. Prosecutor Myers argues that this whole thing is just an attempt to prolong the start of the trial, and this is why he convinces Judge Timmerman to assign new doctors to monitor and assess PB for the next trial. By the way, for you history buffs, at this point, Timmerman Jr. was a year away from retirement, but in 1954, he had actually won the race for the governor of South Carolina, basically unopposed on the Democratic ticket, and completely unopposed in the actual elections because no Republicans ran. He was very opposed to integration of schools and parks and did everything in his power to oppose what he called radical civil rights legislation and radical plants in the platform. That was something unexpected I came across in the research for this video, so I thought I would throw that in there. But moving on here, for the better part of the next year and a half, this case becomes one of the most contentious legal battles in South Carolina, but eventually psychiatrists agree that PB can stand trial. By this time, Judge Timmerman had retired, so Judge Hubert Long takes over the case, and finally, in mid-1985, PB goes to trial. His trial takes a month, but the jury only deliberates for 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. So almost 2 years after the tragedy, the guilty man is finally sentenced to life in prison, plus 10 years for assault and battery. However, the story doesn't end there. A year and a half later, in 1986, the South Carolina Supreme Court reversed the decision and declared that the matter is remanded for a new trial because of an improperly asked question and how the judge improperly asked the jury to just disregard it. Specifically, Solicitor Donald Myers had improperly asked a psychiatrist on the witness stand if they knew that PB refused to make a statement to the police immediately after the event, which seems to imply that this could mean that PB was evoking his right to remain silent, meaning that he's aware what he had done was wrong and didn't want to incriminate himself. Myers' logic was something like, if he's sane enough to know what he did wrong, he can stand trial. This is such an obvious Fifth Amendment violation that many lay readers of the law would likely see it. Or, as Chief Justice Julius Bubba Ness writes, testimony that a defendant refused to comment on an accusation against him is an unconstitutional comment on his post-arrest silence. The state's use of an accused's post-arrest silence as substantive evidence of his sanity breaches the implicit assurances contained in the warnings and violates the 14th Amendment. The solicitor's question was obviously intended to focus the jury's attention on the appellant's post-arrest silence as substantive evidence of his sanity and therefore was improper. So of course, the defense immediately objected and it wasn't answered. But unfortunately, the judge also didn't properly give a curative instruction. Instead, he asked the jurors if any of them remembered the question. One remembered, and so the judge told that juror to forget it and never talk about it. To properly give a curative statement, however, you have to actually repeat the statement and then tell the entire jury to disregard it. Which, while sort of silly and minor to most people, actually is a big deal because the question does shade PB in a sane/guilty light. But on the other hand, the curative instructions are also kind of foolish as you're pointing out the problematic element and then telling somebody to ignore it, kind of like telling you to forget the purple elephant. But because this was improper court procedure, this gave the defense the perfect grounds to argue for a mistrial at the South Carolina Supreme Court, and they agreed. Or as Ness said in his opinion, great care should be exercised in the delicate, difficult, and important matter of instructing the jury to disregard incompetent evidence. The jury should be specifically instructed to disregard the evidence and not to consider it for any purpose during deliberations. A mere general remark excluding the evidence does not cure the error. The error, and the trial judge's failure to take adequate steps to cure the error, require reversal and a new trial. Ness dismisses the other call for a mistrial in this case related to PB's sanity, saying that it's invalid. The defense had also argued that because the federal charges were dropped against PB because of his incompetence to stand trial, PB is also not able to stand trial at the state level. Ness says that this was correctly disregarded as irrelevant because it doesn't prove whether or not he's guilty, it just proves that the charges were dismissed on a federal level. In mid-1987, 4 years after the attack, the second trial is held in nearby McCormick County to give PB a fair trial. A jury of 10 women and 2 men heard the case over a couple of months, but by the end of a long deliberation, the jury was deadlocked, and so the judge had to declare a mistrial, stating, It's sad because 12 other citizens will have to do the job you couldn't or wouldn't do. So a third trial is started in a third county with a third jury and a third judge a month later. This trial lasted from November 9th to the 11th in 1987. This time, the new 10-women, 2-men jury finds Perry B. Smith guilty of murder, and Ninth Circuit Judge William Traxler sentences him to life for the murder, plus 10 years for the assault and battery with intent to kill charge. And the South Carolina Supreme Court rejects his 1989 appeal of this third trial. So finally, 4 years after the tragedy, PB is sentenced, and 6 years later, the matter is finally closed legally. 3 years later, reflecting on a similar tragedy in Oklahoma, Alan Thomas, who unfortunately had 4 surgeries as a result of his injuries, said, "You can't say, hey, I want to forget. You can't forget. It bothers me every day I walk in that post office. I've sat down and thought about it a lot of times. I got shot in Vietnam and it was nothing like this." I was unable to find any substantive legal documentation for PB beyond these court appearances, but the minimum life can be interpreted as 30 years, then maybe parole. But even with that, he'd be serving 40 years and shouldn't be eligible for parole until 2027 when he's 99 or so. And he doesn't appear in the current list of inmates, and I couldn't find him in paroled inmates for South Carolina, so I'm imagining that he died in prison, but I'm not 100% sure. So that just leaves us with the question of his sanity, and this is what the 1989 Supreme Court case is about. The defense argued that he was experiencing delusional disorder, particularly persecutory delusion at the time of the murders. The South Carolina Supreme Court affirmed the previous decision, however, by agreeing with the state's case that you can easily see that this was premeditated and PB intended to kill postal employees for revenge, not out of a persecutory delusion. While I'm not diagnosing PB because I'm not a doctor and I've never met the man, the court took a pretty hard line that it was bogus, and I think the evidence plays that out. So the court looked at the testimony of 4 specific witnesses: his doctor, the chief of police, the transporting officer, and the mail carrier he talked to a few days before the incident, who all testified that they had known PB for years and that he had behaved perfectly normal and without any major change in his personality for years, and with none of the comorbidities or symptoms you'd expect from somebody with delusional disorder and paranoid ideation. Also, the defense's medical experts had testified that anyone with delusional disorder will appear normal until talking about the subject of their delusions. So if PB has persecutory delusions about McGee, then they would have shown when he was talking to the mail carrier specifically about McGee, and likely the post office itself. Instead, he was perfectly normal and pleasant, which is inconsistent with having this disorder. Plus, all the things he said to his victims, specifically what he said to McGee and Albert Turner, were clearly personal and hostile remarks, which would be inconsistent with a disorder based in delusional fears and paranoia. In fact, they're much more easily explainable as revenge. PB was clearly forwardly hostile and not in a panic state. Someone in a panic state wouldn't just say, "I told you I'd get you, you son of a bitch, and you better be glad Joe ran because you were next." This is pretty clear evidence of planning and intentional homicide with specific victims in mind. As you probably know, to successfully argue the insanity defense, you have to prove that at the time of the murder, the defendant couldn't tell right from wrong or couldn't tell that what they were doing is wrong. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I too have to question his insanity defense. On the most basic level, wouldn't he have said different things as he killed his victims? And again, been more defensive rather than offensive? I also don't believe from the evidence that he just snapped or randomly decided to do this one day. In my opinion, he had been planning it at least since threatening McGee earlier in 1983. Further, it seems likely to me that the psychiatrist just misread the symptoms of delusion disorder in what was a rather clear and classic revenge-based homicidal ideation, because at that point they just didn't have much experience with or evidence about mass shooters. Or maybe PB put up a really good front. It's a bold claim, I know, but the courts agreed with me, or I agreed with them. In PB's case specifically, some of his coworkers have said that he liked things in his own way, and he didn't respond well to criticism on a good day. So add grief and stress and feeling like no one cares, and you have the recipe for a pretty intense emotional stew to be sitting in. He likely had fantasies of doing something like that for a long time before doing it. And as his bosses and some of his coworkers turned against him, at least in his mind, he had become more and more of a loner and gradually drifted away from reality. Quitting the post office probably exacerbated this slipping from reality by giving him more time to sit in his thoughts without anyone there to counterpoint his perspective. In other words, it's not like one day PB just decided he's going to do it tomorrow. He'd been going through something similar to what Dr. Joel Norris calls the aura phase in serial killer development, where they gradually lose touch with reality and feel more and more comfortable in their internal fantasies than in reality. And once fully in that fantasy, then serial killers will begin what they call the trolling phase. And that's when they begin paying close attention to and seeking out their victims and locations to murder and hide the bodies, paying careful attention to schedules and interactions, etc., to learn as much as they can about the victim and their surroundings. And though in a certain sense it's problematic to think about mass shooters as being the same or having the same mental structures as serial killers, I think that you can see something very, very similar in some of these cases. And specifically, if you look back at this story, you can see this kind of development as a pretty clear through line. For instance, it starts with him feeling upset that his bosses won't let him get away with problematic behavior. He feels victimized and attacked because they don't understand the grief and stress that he's under and they don't cut him a break. At least he thinks so. So he begins to fantasize about how all his problems are actually just Postmaster McGee's fault. And as more and more problems stack up, this becomes a bigger and a bigger issue, and McGee becomes worse and worse. So this is a pretty common example of what's known as projection. PB is projecting his issues to McGee. PB likely doesn't have the mental strength to handle everything going on, and maybe some deeper rooted emotional issues. And sadly, he's too far gone to see when people have actually cut him a break. For instance, when PB threatened McGee, McGee actually does cut him some slack when he doesn't have PB arrested and lets him keep his job because he recognizes the stress he's under. But unfortunately, when PB resigns, this gives him an endless amount of time to ruminate on his grievances, which is basically just a powder keg waiting to explode. If he were paranoid or fearful, he'd be more likely to never go back. So it's pretty easy to see why the South Carolina Supreme Court agreed with the guilty sentence from his third trial. PB was the kind of man that could be pushed too far gradually given the right circumstances, because he had a mental schema that wouldn't allow him to accept criticism or separate his grief from his work. And he clearly lacked resiliency and coping skills. It's fair to say, for instance, that this event would have been significantly less likely if his son Jimmy hadn't committed suicide. But because he did, PB's mental structure couldn't handle all that weight, especially after his wife started getting sick. And so untreated and unexplored, these kind of things generally get worse, as stress often brings with it things like irritability, insomnia, anxiety, and an inability to see solutions beyond fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And even the nicest of people, even animals, can get mean when they're suffering. Not as a justification, but in this light, we can see a progression from stress at the suicide of his son to feeling anger and feelings of rejection and hurt from believing he was treated unethically by his bosses. Unfortunately, he couldn't see all the breaks they were giving him through his anger. So rather than just snapping one day, this case was more likely built to day by day until it happened. So what about you? What do you think? Do you think PB just snapped one day? Or do you agree with me that this was something that was built up to? Comment below and let us know. And thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And also check out one of these other videos on my channel. And be sure to come back next Tuesday for my next video. I hope to release all of them at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll see you there.